this time, the attorneys will do their closing. And anytime you're ready, Ms. McNeil, you can do your closing argument.
Good morning, everyone. 2023, this year, is the 25th year stolen from Julie Jensen. Birthdays and Christmases and new school years and graduations, all taken from her. When a person dies, their family is devastated, their friends mourn them and remember them. And after all this time, Ruth Vorwald, the first witness, cried thinking of Julie and remembering her death. After all this time, we heard from Angela Martinelli, Kim Noble, Carrie Ashley, Eric and Laura Shore, Therese DeFazio, David and Sharon Naring. We saw the videos of Ted and Margaret Voigt, Marion Passetti. Many, many good and wonderful people have died tragic deaths, but not many people, after all this time, would have so many friends and neighbors coming forward to tell you about them, to tell you what a kind, loving, devoted person they were, as Julie Jensen was. And it matters in this case because, yes, it is possible that even a mother with young children might end her own life, but that is not the evidence in this case. The evidence we have is that Julie told Ted Voigt, Margaret Voigt, Therese DeFazio, and the defendant's own sister, Laura Koster, about her fears that the defendant would kill her. Julie took pictures of things that troubled her in the defendant's day planner and gave them to the police. So the evidence here is not evil murder or tragic suicide. It's murder or it's suicide plus something else. Somebody committed a ghastly crime here. Either Julie Jensen plotted for weeks and weeks since at least mid-October 1998 to kill herself with a substance undetectable at autopsy, to plant evidence with her friends and the police and even in the computer that her husband was responsible, or Mark Jensen, who had tormented and punished and never forgiven his wife for years, found her replacement and then killed her. What a convenient suicide this was for Mark Jensen. Kelly Labonte wasn't just an affair. She was Julie's replacement. That happened, and it happened almost immediately, even without regard for appearances. The defendant didn't have to worry about losing custody of his kids or child support or alimony. How convenient. As an added bonus, he stood to gain $100,000 in the life insurance money, even if Julie's death was ruled a suicide. Julie's death was so convenient for the defendant that he couldn't even resist high-fiving his father after he got his house back from the police. He couldn't wait to throw away Julie's possessions to make room for Kelly. What excellent timing Julie's suicide was for the defendant. The timing was so good that she died before the kids got home on December 3rd, so the defendant didn't have to worry anymore about David's pleas for his mother. Now, this is hard to fathom, and it can be hard to wrap your head around the idea that a respectable member of society, a person with a great job, a nice house, 2 kids, a dog, a pool, an idyllic life, would poison his wife with ethylene glycol and then smother her to death. That's why Julie's affair and the years of harassment that followed matter, because it shows how the defendant felt about his wife. He hated her. What the defendant did to kill his wife is almost past understanding, except he hated her. For nearly all people whose marriages are falling apart, the answer is divorce, not murder. But the defendant hated Julie, and we can prove it. There's the email to his girlfriend. See it on the screen there? You can see the text of the email. Hey, can't forget about you. Can't, don't want to. I miss you. Then you see the email you've seen repeatedly. This is the email to his wife with the pornographic images attached to it. That shows you what he felt about his wife and what he felt about his girlfriend. How he wanted his girlfriend, he had Julie's replacement. And for him, it didn't have to be a divorce because he hated his wife. And now I want to take a look at this harassment that we've shown you before. I just want to take a look at a few things. First of all, I want you to see the extent of it. There's just page after page after page in this exhibit that we showed you of the harassment. It just keeps going on and on and on of Julie tracking it. And remember, we showed you yesterday the page where she was told by the police, hey, you got to keep track of this. You got to help us. So if we take a look at this, we just see some examples of what's happening. This is the page we showed you where she was told by the police to keep track of things. And again, a few examples of the type of harassment that was happening. One of the things that Julie said is it always seemed like the person who was harassing them just was one step ahead. 12/19/95, photos left in truck at Ruther during David's Christmas program. That's quite a stalker there. Finding the truck at Ruther during a Christmas program. That's amazing. That stalker is one step ahead. And then if we just go further, we heard in the testimony too the nature of this harassment. It wasn't just the hang-up phone calls. They would happen at home, but also, according to the defendant, they would happen at his work. The leaving of the pornographic images, they would happen around the home, but also, according to the defendant, they would be left at his work, mailed to him sometimes, but often left on his vehicle at work. These pornographic images, penises and photos of oral sex, or what looked like a woman in position close to a penis, those harassing photos. And we see more examples of that. Several hang-up calls at Mark's office, talking about David finding a tape. Found videotape in front of brick ledge of garage. Then hang-up calls asking how he liked the tape. Then various calls to Mark's office, soft, effeminate male voice referring to video. Photo left on Mark's truck at office. And again, we're not going to go through all of this. It just keeps going. And we showed you this page repeatedly too, the new tactics, which led to the notation of these harassing emails. And we recovered these emails. These were from the zip disk. They were found in the defendant's home, saved on what we would use nowadays would be a USB drive, a thumb drive or a flash drive. But back in the day, it was these zip disks. And what was found on the zip disk is the email that we showed you with the attachments. And because it's the actual email and not a screenshot, that's how we can see it was from Mark Jensen to Mark Jensen, and he saved it, and he saved the images attached to it, and it was on those disks. I also showed you too that he saved some screenshots from a computer, and in the screenshots I showed you in the background, you could see Trading Expert Pro was up in the background. So you know it's from him. So we heard about Julie's hobbies, gardening and crafts and book club. This is the defendant's hobby. This is his hobby. This is what he did for years and years and years until, let's look when it stops. It trails off in June of 1998 and then ends entirely in August of 1998 when the defendant gets his girlfriend. Remember, Julie was alive for months afterwards, but there's no more notes in this harassment log because the defendant has a new hobby. The last thing I want to note about this, 6/19/98, definitely found Mark's new office phone number, ranted, raved, and swore at the receptionist, several hang-ups at the office after that. This was after Mark had moved to Stiefel Nicholas. We heard from the receptionist, Meredith Perez. She never got a call like this. Just more proof that this was fabrication. And think about the torment to Julie, because although Mark is reporting these things, who's at fault? It's her, because it's the man she had an affair with. And she has to tell the police about it. And when she tells the police about it, she has to repeat over and over and over again that she had an affair. And she even asked for one police officer, please, Pleasant Prairie, just send me one police officer so I don't have to tell the story again. We even have the defendant making Julie think the pictures were her. And if you saw this email, you saw how he would do it. In this email, the harasser is pretending that he's taking a picture without her knowing it of a married girl that he's currently doing. Just the kind of trickery that was used with Julie. The man she had an affair with must have taken secret pictures of her. And now these are pictures of her that he's leaving around. This is gaslighting. And Julie's a smart person, but she's just constantly being lied to and deceived by her husband. And she's told by the police and the private investigator, hey, we think it's your husband, but she doesn't want to believe it. Now, remember the defendant's interview. We showed you several clips from that recorded interview, not the greatest recording, 1998. But we showed you several clips from it, the defendant's own statements. And the defendant was confronted by Detective Ratzberg about this harassment. And what the defendant said, well, he said he'd find them around the house, these pictures, because he did. He'd find them around the house, but it was a question of showing them to her. He said he did end up showing a majority of them to her. And then here's what he said. How many times do you have to see pictures like that and get reminded of it before you kind of go, man, it's not worth it. It gets old and you put it away. And I'd put them away and then something would happen and I'd get pissed off and I'd pull some out and I'd say I found these in the shed. Then the question was, when in fact you had them? And Mark says, I had them. I mean, they'd accumulate for weeks. How many times do you have to see pictures like that? Who has an interest in exactly those kind of pictures? That's why this evidence matters, because Mark's obsession with these types of pictures, with these penis photos categorized on his computer, with photos of oral sex, this obsession was his, and those are exactly the harassing pictures that would be left around. And yet he acts to the detective like, oh, how many times you got to see it? He wants to see it. That's what he wants to look at. So we know it's him because of that too. And it's another lie to the detective. Remember how much Mark Jensen struggled when asked about Kelly Labonte? He just wouldn't say, even at the present moment, that she was his girlfriend. He, of course, wasn't going to admit to the affair before. But even in the present, he couldn't say she was his girlfriend. She had moved to Wisconsin at that time. She'd moved for him, but he wouldn't say it. So I said from the outset, the defendant was under no obligation to forgive Julie. If he had filed for divorce after the affair, you know what? Even if he did hate her forever after that, as long as he ended the relationship with divorce, then we wouldn't be here. But he never forgave her. That's what his friend from work, David Naring, said. That's what his friend noticed. Julie knew it too. It's one of the last things she said. She told Dr. Borman on December 1st about that affair and how she thought the defendant had never forgiven her. And that's not the only thing that Julie said on December 1st, because even though her marriage was falling apart and she was miserable, when she was asked about depression and whether she would ever kill herself, she said never. She would never leave her boys. And how many witnesses did we hear from in this case? It was a lot of witnesses. Not a single witness, not a single one testified that Julie Jensen ever made suicidal statements, that she ever had suicidal ideation, that she ever made a suicide attempt. Not a single one. Instead, what we can see in the evidence through the computer evidence is the timeline of the defendant's plot. That's why those emails with Kelly Labonte, the defendant, and Julie's day planner, their respective interests matter, because we can see the defendant's life reflected in those internet searches, that internet activity, and we simply do not see anything similar for Julie. Remember how dismissive Dr. Thomas was of Julie's lack of computer knowledge? You are to decide this case based on the evidence, not on cognitive bias, not on some make-believe story that's unsupported by the evidence. In contrast with the defendant, we have evidence that Julie Jensen was very unfamiliar with computers. That's the evidence. The very beginning of September 1998, that's when she has that conversation with Therese DeFazio. Therese specifically asked her about helping in the computer lab, and Julie said no. She was there to be helpful, but she just couldn't. She just didn't know about computers. And they joked about how slow she typed, 35 words a minute. Then we have Julie applying for the job at Bradford High School. Joe Mangi told you about that. Well, back in 1998, that job she was applying for, even for a high school, even an office in a high school, it wasn't a computer job. The secretaries at that time didn't even have computers. So Julie was very well qualified for that job. And when Julie had that conversation with Therese DeFazio about her being afraid the defendant was going to poison her, how she had seen the defendant on the computer, but he would turn it off or cover up the screen, Ms. DeFazio suggested, well, maybe she could look at the computer cache and maybe she could see what the defendant was up to. And Ms. DeFazio was familiar with a Macintosh, and so that's what she was suggesting. But Julie said she didn't know how to do that. She wouldn't know what to do. Ms. DeFazio even remembered David doing what kids do, right? They blurt something out about their mom. Oh, my mom doesn't know anything about computers. And it's funny, I'm teaching her. And it started a whole class discussion where all the other little kids joined in. And Ms. DeFazio explained, well, that was normal back then. Computers were just getting in the home in 1998. I am going to emphasize once again, you are to decide this case based on the evidence. So I am going to show you the evidence, and I'm going to go through that with you, because what I say or what they say, it doesn't matter if it's not supported by the evidence. So let's look at the timeline of the defendant's plan that we can see through the computer evidence. So we've seen this before, the dates and the times of this computer use. Now, the argument that you've heard from the defense is that, well, there's no computer use during normal work hours because Julie wouldn't have wanted to block the phone line. That argument is absurd and it's unsupported by the evidence, because not only is the internet on this home computer not used during normal work hours when the defendant wasn't home, but it also wasn't used at all when the defendant was out of town. So let's look at September. September 2nd. You zoom in. September 2nd, no internet activity. The defendant's in St. Louis. How do we know that? We have his day planner. We also have those emails. Here's the email from Kelly, September 3rd. Thanks again for yesterday. They were together in St. Louis on the 2nd. There's no internet activity on the 2nd. Let's go to later in September. We have another trip to St. Louis. We have computer activity, internet activity, the early morning hours of the 11th, but then the defendant goes to St. Louis that day, 11th and 12th. And again, how do we know it? It's right here in his day planner, and it's in the emails. Let's look at what Kelly had to say about that time frame. Her email, September 9th. She says on the bottom, a massage tomorrow and you the next day. How perfect can one life be? Tomorrow the 10th, the defendant the next day, the 11th. Let's go to October. The defendant and Kelly Labonte are in Appleton. No internet activity those days. This is the time period when the defendant and Kelly Labonte are going to Appleton. They're going to open up that office, the office where Ed Klug works. So this is where the defendant would have met Ed Klug in person, and where the other people opening that office noticed there was something going on between the defendant and Kelly Labonte. So now, what about Sunday, October 11th? We do have internet activity in the afternoon on that day. It's afternoon internet activity. Maybe this is Julie. Patagonia. It's the Patagonia website that's being looked at. And then what do we have the next day? Email from Mark to Kelly. This is where he's trying to buy some things for his girlfriend, right? A treat, spoiling his girlfriend. Now imagine we didn't have these Patagonia emails to Kelly. How much do you want to bet Julie would have been blamed for these searches for women's clothing? How much you want to bet? She would have been blamed for this computer evidence, but we know who was searching for Patagonia that day. Moving on in October, the trip to Chicago, the very suspicious trip to Chicago. Who needs to stay in a hotel in Chicago when you live in Pleasant Prairie? Well, that's what you do when you're planning a nice long getaway with your girlfriend. And we see it in the day planner, October 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. That's the trip to Chicago. And we see it in the emails. Chicago is the subject. Oakbrook will move on 10/23 and open for business 10/26. Where is Oakbrook in relation to the airport? Any ideas? So this email, right? This planned get together between the defendant and his girlfriend. That happens on October 12th. The early morning hours of October 13th, we have the defendant on the computer planning the Chicago trip, the O'Hare Marriott, Morton's Steakhouse. Then on October 15th, I'm showing you this because it mirrors the defendant's life. On October 15th, we go from Bass Pro Shop to Big Cedar to Windstar Cruises, and we know these early morning searches are the defendant. He's the fisherman, so he's going to Bass Pro Shop. He talked to Kelly about Big Cedar, so he's going to this website. Then Windstar Cruises, early morning hours of October 15th. And what is the next email to Kelly Labonte? This string of emails from October 16th, 1998. Hey, want to run off somewhere? I do love you. Kelly responds, what sparked this bold attempt at messing with me? Sounds wonderful. Where should we go? The defendant says, really bold attempt. If it was really bold, you'd have tickets for the Windstar in your hand. Who was on the internet looking for Windstar? It's obvious, right? These emails are important on October 16th with Kelly Labonte because the defendant has decided he is planning his future with Kelly. He misses her, he wants her, he loves her. He's buying things for her, and he wants to sweep her off her feet with this cruise. Here's what Kelly says. Considering you have a milestone birthday next year, and we would both need some time to clean up our lives, so to speak, I was thinking what a lovely way to spend your birthday. You, me, sunsets, ocean, champagne, no outside issues. See, Kelly understands the practical implications of what the defendant is doing. You just don't go on an expensive, lengthy cruise with your lover on the side. That isn't realistic. So that transforms this conversation into what are you going to do with your spouse? And so Kelly wants time to decide. She wants until the end of the year to decide either way what to do with her issue. The defendant says, fair enough, no deadline on deciding, whatever time needs to be figured out. And then Kelly starts asking him, well, what are you going to do? Do you have it all figured out? The defendant says, I'm thinking so, but then is mostly talking about her, barring seeing a bunch of disgusting habits. Some details to be worked on, but then those are just details, not the big issue. But Kelly wants to know. She wants to know. It was the details I was wondering about. That's what she says. And the defendant just keeps on being vague. Murphy spins on details. Details are just noise in the bigger picture. Kelly, again. And you plan on dealing with the details how? One at a time. So at that point, that's when Kelly says, evasive little shit. Kelly wants to know, what is he going to do? She's asked for the end of the year to deal with her issues, but he's not telling her what he's going to do with his. The defendant isn't telling her what he's going to do with his wife. Kelly calls him out for it. But what we know from the computer is the defendant is forming a plan. He's planning for a future with Kelly by searching for Windstar Cruises. And he's planning for a future without his wife through the other searches on this computer. So it begins with this series of searches on October 16th, 1998, and it starts at 1:54 a.m. I'm not going to show you all of these again, but these are the searches that go from underground to drugs to botulism and ending with poisoning. Then we move to the evening of October 16th, 11:57 p.m., and disturbing searches continue. First, we start with the pipe bomb article. This was the one about the man who was attempting to kill his estranged ex-wife with a pipe bomb. And this browsing session, this one continues for over an hour until about 1 a.m. And I want to show you the various websites that are accessed in this browsing session so you know who is on that computer and doing these searches. We go to the Mercury Fulminate website. Now I want to zoom in a little bit here. So we go from the pipe bomb article to Mercury Fulminate is used as a primary explosive in the fabrication of detonators. Then we go to material required. We have here a list of things including glass containers, tape, syringe. Then we go to a warning. Caution. Acid will burn the skin and destroy clothing. Then we go to this. This is the list that Julie found in the defendant's day planner. It's what she took a picture of. We wouldn't have this if she didn't take a picture of it because it wasn't in there anymore when the defendant's day planner was recovered by the police. So what we see here on this list, and we'll come back to this, but we see bottles, booze. So those could be glass bottles. And then we see syringe on this list. Then we see bag hands, like maybe if acid will hurt your hands. Maybe if you've seen that warning on that website. And next we have a website accessed about pool fun. This pool fun article, it talks about reversing the polarity of a pool. And the article claims that that'll cause an explosion. And again, is this true? Is that how that works? I don't know. But that's what the user of this computer, the defendant, was seeing and what he was looking up. And what do we have next? Nicotine. That's the next search. Who's the smoker here? It's Mark. Julie doesn't smoke. So we go to this nicotine search, the nicotine searches. Let's go back to this list. Nicotrol. That is the stop smoking drug that Dr. Borman prescribed to the defendant. Librium. That's also the defendant's prescription. His own drug supply. Who do you think is on the internet doing these searches? And just in case you weren't sure, these are the searches that end the browsing session. They're for Stiefel Nicholas employees. We see the Appleton office here. Remember that address? 740 Ford Street? It was in the defendant's planner, and David Thompson knew it too. Then for some reason, we're going to Colorado Springs. The employee, the branch manager, John Jock Joseph. We heard from Kelly why the defendant was very interested in John Jock Joseph. Because as we learned, the defendant had exhaustive conversations with Kelly Labonte about every man she had had any sort of sexual encounter with, including detailed descriptions of that man's penis. And Kelly Labonte knows that in the beginning it wasn't so detailed, but she did tell the defendant about John Jock Joseph, including a description of his penis. And she remembers that it was the fall of 1998, and she remembers it was before the Blueprint conference because she remembers seeing him with the defendant, seeing John Jack Joseph and kind of pointing him out to the defendant. They had talked about this man before. There is absolutely no reason why Julie Jensen would be so interested in John Jack Joseph, but we know the defendant was. Then finally, we have the search for Kelly. So why is the defendant searching for Kelly? He knows her name. He knows where she works. But it's a search for Kellys, right? They're all Kellys here. What he wants to know, what the defendant is very interested in, is her last name. Kelly's married by this point, but she hasn't changed her last name yet. The defendant's trying to gauge her relationship with her husband. Has she bothered to change her name yet? Is she really committed to this new marriage? He wants to know, and so he's checking. Oh, she's still Labonte K. And that's how this browsing session ended. October 19th, early morning hours, another search for pipe bomb. Maybe Julie Jensen wanted to build a pipe bomb. Then we have the infamous Blueprint Conference. We see it reflected in the defendant's day planner. This is the conference in St. Louis, the early morning hours of November 7th. This is when the defendant was out drinking with a group at first, then the bar or club closes down, then they're in the lobby hanging out talking, and he ends up alone with Ed Klug. And they were wife bashing, and the defendant told Ed Klug about wanting to kill his wife, looking up ways on the computer to kill his wife, finding something that would crystallize you from the inside out. Now, we saw that video of Dawn Cooper, and I guess she was supposed to demonstrate that maybe that conversation didn't happen because she was also out in the lobby after bar close. But what happened in the end is she said that she left, and the only people there from her group were Mark Jensen and Ed Klug. And we know that it happened. We know that the defendant told these things to Ed Klug because of Joanne Klug. We know that Ed Klug talked to her multiple times the early morning hours and then again later in the day at the airport. She and Ed have been divorced for years now. I think they said it was finalized in 2013. She's never had a reason to lie about this. It's a very memorable conversation. They even have the phone records, right? Really, he was talking to his wife at those early morning hours? Well, yes, he was. Look at the phone records. And Joanne remembered something in particular. She remembered when Ed was at the airport and she was thinking about, kind of ruminating on what Ed had told her, and she was confused because she was wondering, well, how does someone die from Benadryl? She remembers Ed telling her about the Benadryl. And so at the airport, she asked him that question about the Benadryl, and that's when Ed says to her, it's the antifreeze. Joanne Klug came in here and she had no reason to lie. She's long done with Ed Klug. But the truth is that conversation happened. And Ed told Stacy Bauer too. She remembers fewer details than Joanne. What she remembered is hearing that the defendant hated his wife and wanted her dead. But she does remember her immediate reaction when she heard less than a month later that Julie Jensen was dead. Oh my God, he killed her. And Stacy Bauer's opinion doesn't matter. It's not of significance, but what matters is she didn't know the Jensens. The only information she had was from Ed Klug. She knew what Ed Klug had told her when she made that statement. So we know that when Ed Klug got back from the Blueprint Conference, before Julie Jensen died, that he told Stacy Bauer about this deeply disturbing conversation that he had had with Mark Jensen. So that when Stacy hears Julie is dead, that is her first thought. Oh my God, he killed her. Finally, we know this conversation with Ed Klug is true. And we know how damning it is based on the defendant's reaction to it. And that's David Thompson. David Thompson is quite a character. He was in pretty big trouble in 2007. But whatever you want to say about him, when he came to court to tell you what had happened, what the defendant was up to, when he came to court to testify, he wasn't getting out of anything. He admitted he was a bank robber, but he's overcome that, and there's nothing to offer him today because he's not in trouble. Coming here for him was just an inconvenience. And with David Thompson, we have those recorded phone calls from the jail. We know that in the defendant's mind, this plot was real. This plot to sit on Ed Klug, so his testimony would never be heard. And we heard from the video of Nathaniel Clanton that this was the stupidest thing the defendant could have ever done. That's what he thought. But that's how desperately the defendant wanted to silence Ed Klug. There's absolutely no reason for David Thompson to get on the phone with the mother of his child, Kim, and give her Ed Klug's name and work address. The same thing that was in the defendant's day planner, the same thing that was on that internet search. There's absolutely no reason for David Thompson to tell Kim to say everything is as planned to the defendant when he gets on the phone. There's absolutely no reason for the defendant to be asking Kelly to give his parents $500 twice in the most evasive conversation possible. There's absolutely no reason for the defendant to be insistent that his mother get in touch with Kim in multiple calls, except that in the defendant's mind, this was a real plot. And think about that. Why didn't the defendant just leave it to the law and his lawyers? If Ed Klug's a liar, then that's what cross-examination is supposed to show. Cast doubt on him as a witness. And in fact, that's what Nathaniel Clanton said when the defendant discussed this plot with him. He's like, if you think you can beat your case, then why do you need someone to take a witness out? I want you to think about the defendant's thought process. There is a lawful, legal way to challenge Ed Klug's evidence in this case, just like there's a lawful, legal way to end your marriage with the wife you hate. But that's not what the defendant chose. And he's acting all cagey in these phone calls, thinking he's too clever to get caught. And even when talking to his mother, he references, gotta be careful on the phone. This weekend, when we know the defendant was in St. Louis, no internet activity. Once again, we see that pattern. But this weekend is significant in terms of what happened to Julie. She got sick that weekend, and kind of inexplicably so. She threw up on the carpet. And we know that this happened because that carpet cleaning bill, that's from that Monday, the 9th. She threw up on the carpet, and you can see it in the bill. It's also referenced in both of their day planners. Now, this is strange. For an adult to be so sick that they're throwing up in the carpet of their home, that's kind of how kids get sick. Very strange for an adult to be sick in that way. And we know Julie took care of the house, but she was so sick she apparently couldn't clean the carpets. She must have been really sick. Aaron Dillard knew about this. And this is how he explained the defendant cracking. Going from the defendant saying, this is all bullshit, and I didn't do it, to the confession. The defendant had been talking to Aaron Dillard about his case, getting advice from Aaron Dillard, like get those samples retested, which happened. He had been complaining a lot about Ed Klug. Then he told Aaron Dillard that he wished he hadn't made that mistake, had that drunken conversation with Ed Klug, said that's essentially what was screwing him in his case. And he said that it was on his mind because he tried to poison Julie before he left on that trip. He said he was lucky in a way that she didn't die because he really would have been screwed after saying what he said to Ed Klug. Aaron Dillard knew this, and Aaron Dillard said this, and Aaron Dillard described this admission from the defendant, opened the floodgates for the rest of the defendant's story. And this wasn't in Ed Klug's testimony. Ed Klug didn't know about Julie getting sick. Now, it wasn't Ted Voigt's testimony. That testimony, though, it didn't happen until January 2008. So that's half a year after Aaron Dillard came forward. And this is what you saw in that video the first week of trial. It seems like long ago now. But Ted Voigt talked about a time when Julie said she was throwing up. And he talked about how suspicious Julie became of the defendant trying to get her to drink something. And he described how Julie was telling him about the defendant trying to get her to drink some wine, and she didn't want to. And he was so insistent that it became a big argument. And I hope you can remember Ted Voigt's testimony, or at least look back on your notes. Because you see, that's the thing. This is such a massive case. There's so many facts and there's so much evidence, and it's hard to keep track of and wrap your mind around. And this incident with Julie getting sick that weekend, that's one of those hidden facts. What's the significance of it? Well, how would Aaron Dillard know? He was with the defendant for less than 4 days. How would he know? Why would he pull out that little fact? Unless the defendant told him and told him that it was significant. So let's go to our next group of searches. The next timeline the computer gives us, November 10th, 1998, once again, the early morning hours. Here's the search for suicide. So maybe this is Julie. Maybe she's on the computer searching for suicide, joining some kind of suicide group or whatever. Let's see what comes next in this browsing session. We go to physician-assisted suicide, leading to a website about an advocate for physician-assisted suicide. Is 40-year-old Julie Jensen a good candidate for physician-assisted suicide? She's healthy. She has 2 young children. She doesn't have a terminal illness. What do you think Dr. Borman would have said if Julie came and asked him about whether physician-assisted suicide was for her? This search makes no sense for Julie. It does make sense for the defendant who's looking for a way to kill. Next, we have a toxicology website. Toxic alcohols. Ethylene glycol. (2:57 a.m.). So right along this same browsing session, we're back to nicotine. Now, we can't actually see every website that was visited. As Jason Ruff from the Wisconsin Department of Justice explained, we have the internet history, that's the Excel file, but we don't have the HTML files for all the websites visited, which means we can see that there were websites visited, but we can't actually see them on the screen. But even though we can't see the websites themselves, let's look at some of the websites that were visited on November 22nd, 1998. So 11:22, 4:50 p.m. Oh, 4:50 p.m. This is a Sunday. We have Anatomy Adam, poison. Anatomy Adam, that website comes up a lot on December 2nd and December 3rd. Then we have a Yahoo search, 11:22, 5:01 p.m. for drug interactions. Remember David Naring? David Naring knew the defendant told him that all the time the defendant was looking on his computer at work for drug interactions. Before Julie's death, after Julie's death. Just like Dave Naring said the defendant was looking for drug interactions, so we see it on the home computer. Then we go to the top and we get what looks like prescription list, rxlist.com, drug. Could that be Benadryl? At the very top, could that be diphenhydramine? Generic for Benadryl? All of these searches within minutes of each other, 11:22:98, a Sunday. Now let's go to 11:26:98. Got some science units, measurements. This is all 11:26:98, 11:06 p.m. Potassium chloride, pool solutions. Then 11:29:98, Sierra antifreeze. That website was accessed. 11:29:98. We know the computer history was deleted that day. So December of 1998, these are very significant searches that we're going to look at. This activity. Now we see there's something at 1:18 a.m., but that's actually not a browsing session. That was just one HTML that was accessed. So really in December, when we're talking about the browsing sessions, this is what we're going to be talking about. So we know about December 1st. We know that's the day that Julie goes to Dr. Borman, and we know that that's the day the defendant gives her the first dose of ethylene glycol, because by the early morning hours of December 2nd, she is showing the symptoms of ethylene glycol intoxication. She's acting drunk. That's the first stage of ethylene glycol poisoning. And so what happens when Julie is acting drunk in those early morning hours? 4:35 a.m., we have the search for paroxetine. Paxil. That's the antidepressant. And so this time, this is when the defendant goes on the internet and he looks up this website for paroxetine, Paxil, and he shows it to Julie, and he shows her all those side effects, a ton of side effects, as a way to soothe her worries, because she doesn't know why she's acting like this, why she's feeling like this, but she went to the doctor and she got that medicine, and so now there's an excuse. This doctor visit was very important to the defendant. Julie was scared. She wasn't just going to drink or eat what the defendant gave her, particularly when he was trying to force it on her, just like with the wine. But what if instead of force, he used deception? Something he's very well practiced in. What if he behaved how Julie wanted him to behave all along? What if he acted like he cared? What if he acted like he was concerned? What if he was good to her? He's making sure she's taking her new medication, something to drink along with it, and when she starts feeling these strange effects, he has something to blame it on, something he can show her on the internet, something to soothe her. Remember the morning of December 2nd, Julie Jensen talks to Margaret Voigt on the phone, her neighbor, and she sounded drunk. And that wasn't Julie, right? Every single witness who knew Julie told you she would not be drunk in the middle of the day. She sounded drunk because she was in the first stages of ethylene glycol poisoning, and Margaret Voigt was worried about her. But Julie said that Mark got the kids to school and he was being good to her. Right before that search for paroxetine or Paxil, we have a bunch of searches for Volvo cars. And this only matters because then we know it's not Julie. If she's sick, if she's feeling very strange, if she's looking for a reason, well, she's not looking at Volvo cars first. So that is the first internet activity, 4:31 to 4:35 on December 2nd. And I'm going to go through this internet activity in detail with you because this is an enormous case with so much material and so many witnesses and so much detail, but it's actually really simple. The person who was on this computer looking up ethylene glycol poisoning killed Julie Jensen. And I'm going to show you it was the defendant. So let's go. We're going to go to the second group of these searches, 8:14 to 8:49 a.m. And this is an unusual time to see internet activity on this computer, a unique time. And what we know about the morning of December 2nd is that the defendant didn't go to work. He got the kids off to school, David on the bus, Douglas to daycare, but he didn't go to work because he was going to Dr. Borman's that morning. So what happened in this next group of internet searches? We are going to see searches for ethylene glycol poisoning and specifically websites that include the symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning. So I'm just going to page through these searches. Ethylene glycol poisoning, that's the first one. Oxalic acid, we learned that that's one of those breakdown products. Hard to say, I think it's fomepizole. That's the antidote. Toxic alcohols. How do patients with toxic alcohol ingestions typically present? We're getting to symptoms. Now for a moment, we're back to paroxetine, Paxil. What follows that? Ethylene glycol. We're seeing the symptoms: development of acidosis, tachycardia, hypertension, cardiogenic shock. And again, whether this is true or not, this is just on the internet, but this is what the person in front of the computer saw. So why is this research happening at about 8:15 a.m., starting at about 8:15 a.m.? The defendant has a problem. Julie has begun experiencing this first stage of ethylene glycol symptoms, and she's already worried about it. She's worried about it, and the defendant needs to know what's coming next, and he needs to know how to pacify her, or better yet, sedate her. So he decides to go to Dr. Borman. And this is what we saw from the defendant's book. Kelly told us about this book. how the defendant is planning to make some money off of this book. And he describes this trip to Dr. Borman, talking to the receptionist counter, explaining how yesterday Julie was here to see him. Let's look at his description of what he was doing. Wearing an expensive suit and a Rolex gives a presentation of authority and genuine legitimacy. And when accompanying a reasonable and polite request, frequently achieves the desired results. Really gives you a glimpse into the defendant's mind. He goes to Dr. Borman, he's got his suit, he's got his Rolex, he's giving a presentation of genuine legitimacy. Why does he have to give a presentation of genuine legitimacy? This trip to Dr. Borman isn't legitimate at all. And unfortunately for Dr. Borman thought it was. You heard in Dr. Borman's testimony, he had the best interests of Julie Jensen at heart, and he thought the defendant did too, and that's why he gave the defendant that prescription. But Dr. Borman told you that if he had known all the facts, what exactly was going on, he would never have given that prescription to the defendant. But the defendant had this air of genuine legitimacy, and he knew it. So this leads us to the third browsing session on December 2nd, 11:45 to 11:47 a.m. We know the defendant had that Ambien prescription in his hand by 11:13 a.m. That was the video of Mark Hunter. He was shown that picture of the Walgreens thing on the counter. 11:13 a.m., that's when he got that Ambien prescription. It's right on the Walgreens receipt. And we know that he wanted to give Julie the Ambien right away. That's what the defendant said in his interview, that recorded interview. Julie's first Ambien, he gave it to her Wednesday morning. So he goes home, he gives her the Ambien, and he gets on the internet. Anatomy Adam, that's what this website is. The one with the poisons, down there at the bottom. Go to E. Ethylene glycol. Once again, we have poisoning caused by ethylene glycol. We have the symptoms. Symptoms listed: rapid breathing, skin, lips and fingernails blue, heart and blood vessels, rapid heartbeat, low blood pressure, headache, stupor, unconsciousness. Then we have a gap, 11:45 a.m. to 11:47 a.m., nothing until 9:31 p.m. So what happened after that? What is happening on December 2nd for the Jensens? The defendant, we have no reason to doubt this, he did go to work in the afternoon. David's at school, and we know that that's the day Julie was supposed to go to school. That's the Wednesday, but she didn't make it to Therese DeFazio's class that day. And David had the note, and David's note asked if he could go to Eric Shore's house. So David isn't coming home from school on the school bus. He's going to his friend Eric Shore's house. And Douglas is in daycare full-time now, starting that week. Full-time daycare. And so the defendant and David and Douglas are not back at that house. In fact, they had karate that night. So they're not back at that house until like 6:30, 7 at night. During all this time that Julie is alone, no internet activity. This is the night where the defendant had to cook because Julie was in bed. He makes mac and cheese. And how was Julie doing during this time period? What was her condition in this time period? Well, the defendant told Paul Griffin in one of those recorded phone calls how Julie was doing. The defendant said, the night before, that's the night when I made the mac and cheese, botched that real good. She wasn't even awake much. I mean, she was in bed the whole time. I mean, she was sleeping most of the time. I think the kids were being quiet to not wake her. I mean, there was some conversation that night, but she was pretty much out of it. So while Julie's pretty much out of it, what's happening on the internet? 9:31 p.m. to 9:43 p.m. Antifreeze poison. Poisoning caused by ingestion of antifreeze with the symptoms. Breathing rapid. We know that was happening. David saw that. Hypoxia. Lips bluish. Fingernails bluish. Skin discoloration, bluish. We saw that as one of the symptoms. Blood pressure, low. Hypotension, low blood pressure. That's what was happening on the internet when Julie was pretty much out of it and didn't leave her bed. Now we're moving to 12/3. The early morning hours, this browsing session on 12/3, 12:44 a.m. to 1:23 a.m. Antifreeze poisoning. How do you think Julie's doing? 12:43 a.m. to 1:23 a.m. Well, we kind of know how Julie's doing. Unconsciousness. Consciousness decreased. Here's another search. Ethylene glycol poisoning. Hypertension. Pulse bounding. Here's another symptom we saw. Tachycardia, fast heartbeat, pulse bounding. Here's another one we saw. Cardiogenic shock. Pulse weak or absent. You know how sometimes you go on the computer because you got like a pain in your side or something's happening with your neck or whatever? You ever look up pulse weak or absent for yourself? How about unconsciousness? You ever look that up when you're experiencing that as a symptom? We know how Julie Jensen was doing from 12:44 a.m. to 1:23 a.m., not because she's on the computer looking at these symptoms, because the defendant is. He's hoping she'll be dead by morning. So then we go to the last browsing session on this computer, 9:40 to 9:42 a.m. on the 3rd. But let's talk first about how Julie was doing the morning of December 3rd, the morning of her death. David said that his mother was breathing very heavily, raspy, labored breathing. He told his friends about it. He later told the detective about it. He asked his dad to take his mom to the hospital, and his dad said no. But his dad said, if she's worse later in the day, we'll take her. What does the defendant say about it? And we know the defendant said this. This is all from that recorded interview. Okay, that's not in dispute, what the defendant said about it. Various points within the interview. He's asked about this multiple times. She couldn't get out of bed that morning. The defendant says, you can ask David. She couldn't get out of bed. He wanted to stay home because mom was sick. She was asleep in bed. The defendant says, there was a question between myself and the kids that morning, whether or not to call an ambulance. Take her to the hospital. The kids wanted to stay home. Her breathing was funny. The defendant says from 6:30 in the morning, she was not able to get out of bed. I mean, she was groggy, almost incoherent, breathing very labored, raspy. The defendant said, I'm not even sure she was coherent. The defendant was asked if Julie sat up in bed. The defendant says, David tells me, we talked about it, David tells me that I was holding her up, supporting her. That's the part of the interview where the defendant talks about those 3 Ambien pills. One Wednesday morning, one Wednesday night, another one Thursday morning after the kids went to school. The defendant says he had to bring her water because she couldn't get out of bed. David told us the last memory he has of his mother is she said, I love you, and he said it too. What David said to the defendant, what the defendant said in his interview is that David told him mom couldn't talk that morning. I'm glad that David's last memory is I love you, but what he was saying to his dad was that his mom couldn't talk that morning. The defendant repeats again, she couldn't get out of bed. He talks about the sleeping pills and how the day before he couldn't rouse her at all. Then finally, we have that recording between the defendant and Paul Griffin, Julie's brother, talking about that morning, December 3rd. The defendant talks about he sat behind Julie on the bed, supporting her when the kids came in, getting ready for school. The defendant says she was weak enough by Thursday. If she could have gotten out of bed, it would have been crawling. Who's on the computer that morning at 9:40 a.m.? We know the defendant wasn't at work. We know he wasn't at work. 3 coworkers say that. We have Ruth Vorwald and her sister, and we have Ted Voigt. All of them, those witnesses, place the defendant either going to his house or at his house, arriving to his house between 9:15 and 9:30 a.m. that morning. He had to get Douglas to daycare. He went to pick up a check from someone down the road, but those witnesses say that he was at his house or going to his house between 9:15 and 9:30 a.m. And here's the defendant's dilemma. He was hoping when he left that morning that he would come back and Julie would be dead. But he comes back and she's still alive. So he goes on the internet one more time. That search, when Julie was incoherent, when she couldn't get out of bed, when David said she couldn't even talk, there's that search for ethylene glycol poisoning. Then we go to a website for diabetic ketoacidosis, because we learned in the medical evidence that you get acidotic from this ethylene glycol poisoning. And apparently something similar can happen to a diabetic person in crisis. The defendant's looking at that too. The last thing on the computer, ethylene glycol poisoning. This is why the defendant ultimately suffocates his wife. She would have died from ethylene glycol poisoning, untreated as she was. But the defendant can't take her to the hospital. And first, when he comes home and she's not dead, he hopes if maybe he just turns her. We know she's unconscious because of how her arm is under her body as he turns her. He's hoping if he just turns her, maybe has her face in the pillow, maybe she'll just die. And he leaves and he comes back. But she's still alive. She didn't die, and he promised, and he's running out of time. And Aaron Dillard was able to put into words what the defendant did. Aaron Dillard gained the defendant's trust, as Aaron Dillard does. But the evidence was all there to begin with. That promise to David, Julie's body, how it was positioned, the medical evidence of the hemorrhage, the suffocation. Dr. Chambliss suspected suffocation from the very beginning. So there's things we're never going to know in this case. We're not going to know what the defendant did when he didn't go to work on December 3rd, as he claimed. Dave Naring, Rosemary McGinnis, Meredith Perez, the receptionist at this small office, they all know he wasn't there that day. What exactly was he up to? What exactly was he doing? How exactly did he clean up? What did he do with the ethylene glycol he used? What about the juice that he put it in? Was that juice still in the fridge, or did he clean that up like the ethylene glycol? One thing we do know is the defendant did try to clean up. One of the reasons I spent all this time showing you the internet history is that the defendant never wanted you to see it. He deleted the internet history on this computer. We know he deleted it 11/29, 12/2, and 12/3. It's only because the police had the foresight to seize this computer in 1998, and only because the computer was analyzed by experts at the Wisconsin Department of Justice to see and get this deleted internet history, the defendant didn't want you to see it. Now, it seems that in this case, everything is blamed on Julie Jensen. But remember, this isn't a murder or just a sad suicide. It's a murder or a suicide and a frame-up. If this was Julie Jensen on the computer, and I've already showed you that that's impossible, but if this was Julie Jensen on the computer, hypothetically, why would she delete that internet history? It's not what you do after planting with your friends and your neighbors that your husband's trying to kill you. If you want to frame your husband, you don't delete it. But it is what you do when you're trying to clean up and cover your tracks. So finally, at the close here, let's talk about Julie Jensen's two greatest fears. Dr. Borman said in his testimony she didn't want to be labeled as crazy and she didn't want to lose her kids. With her death, Julie Jensen lost David and Douglas. And in death now, nearly 25 years later, she's labeled as crazy. We're having a whole trial on the topic of whether Julie's crazy. The tragedy of Julie Jensen, and there are many, is she can't escape gaslighting even in death after all this time. Because we're told that Julie apparently has this family history of depression that makes her a high risk for suicide, even though the actual evidence is that that history is so minor that it makes her family indistinguishable from thousands or perhaps even millions of other families. And that family history pales in comparison to the history of other families, like where there have been actual suicides. We're told that Julie Jensen is at a high risk for suicide. And I can hardly even begin to comment on the absurdity of Dr. West's testimony. But Dr. West said Julie Jensen's view of reality was distorted. The only thing that I saw that was distorted is Dr. West's view of the evidence. But one preposterous thing Dr. West said was how Julie showed signs of suicidality. Even though she'd never made a suicidal statement, she'd never shown any signs of suicidal ideation or a plan. She certainly never attempted suicide, even though Julie Jensen specifically denied being suicidal on December 1st. There's literally nothing, apparently, that Julie could have said to evade Dr. West's diagnosis of major depressive disorder. Nothing she could have said. And what about all these statements she made of fear? To Ted Voigt, to Margaret Voigt, to Therese DeFazio, to the defendant's own sister. We're told she's just so crazy. Too crazy to be believed. I mean, is she actively framing the defendant, or is she just so delusional that she thinks the defendant's trying to kill her? We're told that Julie used the internet, that she would use the internet, even though there's absolutely no proof of that. We saw how that internet usage mirrors the defendant's life, and there's nothing like that for Julie. Not a single example. Dr. Hale and Dr. Thomas, they tell you, they act as though Julie could have been on that computer, even after she got so sick the night of 12/2 and into the early morning of 12/3, and then finally at 9:42 a.m. on 12/3. Even though that's contrary to the defendant's own words, the words of the defendant. And you know what? We're believing the defendant's words when he described Julie's condition, not just selectively because we want to believe those words because they're helpful to the state. We believe it and we know it's true because of David. The defendant knew David was talking about his mom and about her condition and about his last memories of his mother. The defendant knew the detective was talking to David. That's why there's all those weird statements in that interview. Well, David said, you can ask David. The defendant cannot lie about Julie's condition on the 2nd and the 3rd because David knows the truth. And then finally, these doctors, Dr. Thomas in particular, they blame Julie. Why didn't she call for help? My goodness, if she was so afraid of being poisoned, why didn't she call for help? Well, why didn't the defendant? Julie had in her system ethylene glycol and Ambien and Librium and Paxil and Benadryl. She, a 115-pound woman, had 3 Ambien, a brand new drug for her, in 24 hours, less than 24 hours. And the defendant was there. He saw her condition. He was there the morning of the 2nd, the night of the 2nd, the day of the 3rd. And he was there when Dr. Borman told him, if your wife's condition worsens, take her to the ER. And he was the one hearing David asking to take mom to the hospital when she couldn't speak. And somehow, according to the defense doctors, that's Julie's fault. That this woman on these 3 Ambien, sedated and drugged, it's her fault that she didn't call for help. It's like the more you get paid in this case, the less you can see the obvious. Julie's even blamed for Laura Koster leaving her job. Somehow that's Julie's fault. Julie's blamed for David's cough, David's tics, even though it was at her insistence that they scheduled that specialist appointment for David after those parent-teacher conferences. Dr. Borman testified they scheduled that specialist November 25th, but somehow that's still Julie's fault. Apparently everything, all ills can be blamed on Julie. Apparently she's crazy, and she's the one who was on that computer. But you know, it wasn't her whose hobby it was to create a stalker and invent years of terrorizing harassment using an array of pornographic photos. That wasn't Julie. And it wasn't her who took on the name of Warm Irish Eyes to catfish and torment a coworker. So let's go back to the evidence. At the time of her death, Julie Jensen was in a dilemma of the defendant's creation. And she described this to Therese DeFazio and to Ted Voigt. Either her husband was trying to kill her, to poison her, or he was trying to drive her crazy, make her look crazy, so in the divorce he could take the kids from her, as he said he would do. And Julie was a smart person, but she didn't know what to do in that dilemma. And she couldn't do anything rash, anything that looked reckless or irrational. She had to make a plan. She had to leave in an orderly and rational fashion with the kids, but the defendant had been planning longer, and he executed his plan first. Let's look at him executing his plan. This, we see here two things that are the same. This is the picture that Julie Jensen took of the defendant's day planner and made sure she got it to the police. It says, withdrawn, kids, locked chest, crying about miscarriage. Next to that, the defendant's actual day planner, seized by the police. Same thing. Another example. A picture Julie Jensen took and gave to the police. Locked chest. Locked in bedroom, morning. Jobs quit, crying about miscarriage. Suddenly detached. Julie Jensen took that picture and gave it to the police, and we see the same thing in the defendant's day planner. That day planner, by the way, found right here, right by the computer, in that black bag, the defendant's day planner. This, what I've just showed you, this is gaslighting once again, and Julie saw it. Even if the police had made a mistake and not seized the defendant's day planner, even if that planner had not been seized, we would still have those photos. The police would have them because Julie gave it to them. And did Julie give those to the police to say, hey, police, look how crazy I am? Julie saw the defendant's plan. He wanted her to look crazy. She told this to Margaret Voigt, how the defendant was asking about this miscarriage, which was from years ago, and taking notes, and it made no sense to her. And she saw these notes, and she knew they weren't true, and wondered what the defendant was up to, and she made sure the police had it. Because Julie isn't crazy, it's just how the defendant wanted her to look. It's a continuation of the years of psychological warfare the defendant waged against his wife, but now the purpose was to make her look crazy so he can murder her, so he could give her a substance that would crystallize her from the inside out, a substance undetectable at autopsy, using a searches on the computer that he also thought would be undetectable once he deleted them. He thought he could trick Julie and the police, and honestly, if it ever came down to it, a jury. And if he hadn't made a few mistakes. Ed Klug, Aaron Dillard, David Thompson, the deleting of the internet history that wasn't deleted enough, maybe he would have been able to deceive and gaslight his way out of this too. Julie wasn't crazy. She was responding to the insane situation the defendant had orchestrated around her. If you look at the evidence in this case, if you look at the evidence, and if you aren't getting paid too much to see it, you'll believe Julie. You'll believe Julie when she said she was afraid, when she said she was afraid that the defendant was trying to kill her, when she said she saw the defendant looking things up on the computer, when she said he thought he was trying to poison her. You'll believe Julie when she said she wasn't suicidal, that she wouldn't do it. You'll believe Julie when she said her boys were everything to her, that she loved them, she didn't want to lose them, she would never leave them. You'll believe Julie, and you'll find the defendant guilty.